Hello, and welcome to Tales of History. If you're settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, and looking for a story to help you drift off to sleep, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're exploring one of history's greatest mysteries. A story that has puzzled scholars, codebreakers, and scientists for over a century. A tale of ancient secrets, impossible languages, and a book that no one on Earth can read. There's no need to follow every detail. Just let the story wash over you. Let your mind wander through the centuries as we explore the enigma of the Voynich Manuscript. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our journey into the past. Imagine holding a book in your hands. A book filled with hundreds of pages of flowing text, intricate illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts that make no sense, and human figures engaged in bizarre rituals. You open it, eager to read, but you can't. Not because you don't know how to read, but because this book is written in a language that no one on Earth can understand. Now imagine that this book has existed for over 600 years, that some of the greatest minds in history have tried to decode it, that World War II codebreakers, artificial intelligence, and linguists from every corner of the globe have attempted to crack its secrets. And they've all failed. This is the Voynich Manuscript, and tonight we're going to explore every mystery, every theory, and every failed attempt to understand what might be the world's most mysterious book. For the next 2 hours, I invite you to join me on a journey into one of history's greatest unsolved puzzles. Get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, and let's begin our exploration of the Voynich Manuscript. Our story begins in 1912, though the manuscript itself is far older. Picture the Villa Mondragone, a stunning Renaissance villa near Rome, Italy. The air is thick with history. The Jesuit order has maintained a library here for centuries, and within its walls lie countless forgotten treasures. Enter Wilfred Voynich, a Polish book dealer with a keen eye for rare manuscripts. Voynich was no ordinary antiquarian. He was a revolutionary in his youth, imprisoned by the Russians, escaped from Siberia, and eventually settled in London, where he established himself as one of the most respected rare book dealers in Europe. On this particular day in 1912, Voynich was examining a collection of books the Jesuits were quietly selling to raise funds. As he sifted through medieval texts and illuminated manuscripts, his hands fell upon something that would consume the rest of his life and baffle generations to come. It was a small book, roughly 6 by 9 inches, bound in worn vellum. As he opened it, Voynich's trained eye immediately recognized something extraordinary. The pages were filled with text in an unknown script. Not just a few pages, but over 200 pages of dense, flowing writing, accompanied by bizarre illustrations. Voynich had seen countless medieval manuscripts. He knew Latin, Greek, various European languages, and could recognize Hebrew, Arabic, and other scripts. But this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Let's pause here and describe what the manuscript actually looks like, because understanding its physical nature is crucial to understanding why it's so baffling. The Voynich manuscript consists of approximately 240 vellum pages, though scholars believe some pages are missing. Vellum, for those unfamiliar, is a writing material made from specially prepared animal skin, typically calf skin. It was expensive and primarily used for important documents. The text itself flows from left to right, much like European languages. The letters, if we can call them that, are written in a flowing, cursive style that suggests the writer was comfortable with this script, whoever they were. The writing appears natural, not labored or artificial. But here's where it gets truly strange. The manuscript is divided into several distinct sections, each with its own character. The botanical section makes up the largest portion of the book. Page after page shows detailed drawings of plants. At first glance, they look like an herbal, a common type of medieval book that documented plants and their medicinal properties. But look closer, and something is wrong. These plants, they don't exist. Some have flowers that seem familiar, but roots that are utterly alien. Others have leaves arranged in patterns that no known plant species exhibits. Each illustration is accompanied by text, presumably describing the plant, but of course we cannot read it. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams that resemble zodiac charts. There are suns, moons, and stars scattered throughout. Some pages fold out to reveal larger diagrams, but again, these aren't quite like any astronomical charts we know. The symbols don't match known constellations. The arrangements don't correspond to any celestial events we can identify. The biological section, as scholars call it, is perhaps the most bizarre. It shows numerous small female figures, nude, bathing in what appears to be a complex system of tubes and pools filled with dark liquid. The women seem to be emerging from or entering these pools. Some scholars have suggested these represent baths, or perhaps alchemical processes. Others have more esoteric theories. We'll explore these later. The cosmological section features more circular diagrams, but these seem to represent something different from the astronomical charts. They're more complex, with multiple concentric circles, strange symbols, and what might be representations of islands or castles in some of the circles. The pharmaceutical section shows what appear to be jars and containers of various types, each labeled with text. These resemble medieval pharmaceutical books, which would list remedies and their preparations. The recipe section, at the end, contains only text with no illustrations, written in short paragraphs that look like recipes or instructions. When Voynich made his discovery, he knew he had found something potentially revolutionary. But what exactly had he found? A lost medical text? An encrypted grimoire? The work of a genius or a madman? Inside the manuscript, Voynich found a letter. This letter, dated 1665 or 1666, was from Johannes Marcus Marci, rector of Charles University in Prague, to the famous Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. The letter makes extraordinary claims. Marci writes that the book once belonged to Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who ruled from 1576 to 1612. According to Marci, Rudolf believed the manuscript was written by Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher and scientist known as Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher. Marci also mentions that Rudolf paid 600 gold ducats for the manuscript, an enormous sum equivalent to perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars today. This detail is important because it suggests that even in the 17th century, people believed this manuscript contained secrets of immense value. But was any of this true? Was Roger Bacon really the author? Did Rudolf II actually own it? Or was Marci himself fooled by an earlier hoax? These questions would haunt researchers for the next century. After his discovery, Voynich became obsessed with decoding the manuscript. But he was also a businessman. He wanted to sell the book, and to do so, he needed to generate interest and, hopefully, crack its code to prove its value. Voynich made photographic copies and sent them to scholars around the world. He reached out to linguists, cryptographers, medievalists, anyone who might shed light on this mystery. The response was immediate and intense. Scholars were fascinated. Some were convinced it was a simple cipher that could be cracked with enough effort. Others suspected it might be a lost language. Still, others thought it might be an elaborate hoax. But despite all the attention, despite all the brilliant minds that examined it, no one could read a single word. Voynich spent years promoting the manuscript and seeking its decryption. He displayed it at exhibitions. He hired scholars to study it. But by the time of his death in 1930, the manuscript remained as mysterious as the day he found it. The first person to claim they had decoded the Voynich manuscript was William Romain Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1921, Newbold announced to the world that he had cracked the code. According to Newbold, the visible text was merely a cover. The real message was hidden in tiny markings and flourishes in the letters themselves, visible only under magnification. Using an incredibly complex system of his own devising, Newbold claimed the manuscript was indeed written by Roger Bacon and contained advanced scientific knowledge, including descriptions of cellular structure, spiral nebulae, and even spermatozoa, things that wouldn't be observed until the invention of powerful microscopes centuries later. The announcement caused a sensation. Had one of history's greatest mysteries been solved? Had Roger Bacon possessed knowledge far beyond his time? For a few years, Newbold's solution was widely accepted. Here, finally, was proof that the manuscript contained genuine secrets of immense importance. But then, cracks began to appear in Newbold's theory. Other scholars examined his methodology and found it deeply flawed. The tiny markings he claimed were intentional could be explained as natural cracking of the ink and vellum over time. More damning, his decryption method was so flexible that it could be used to extract almost any message from any text. One critic demonstrated this by using Newbold's method to decode a completely ordinary text and find hidden messages that Newbold himself had never intended. By the mid-1920s, Newbold's solution was thoroughly discredited. When he died in 1926, he went to his grave still believing he had solved the mystery, even as the academic world had moved on. But the incident taught researchers an important lesson. The Voynich manuscript could make fools of even brilliant scholars. It was a siren song, luring people toward solutions that seemed to make sense but ultimately dissolved under scrutiny. As the 1930s progressed, a new type of scholar became interested in the Voynich manuscript: professional cryptographers and code breakers. This was the golden age of cryptography. Nations were developing ever more sophisticated codes and ciphers, and brilliant minds were being recruited to break them. Surely, these experts thought they could crack a 600-year-old cipher. Among those who attempted it was William Friedman, one of the greatest cryptanalysts in history. Friedman had broken purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher, during World War II. He had helped establish modern cryptographic methods. If anyone could decode the Voynich manuscript, it would be him. Friedman spent years studying the manuscript. He applied statistical analysis, looking at the frequency of character combinations, the structure of words, patterns in the text. He assembled a team of fellow code breakers, all working together to crack this ancient puzzle. But even Friedman couldn't break it. He noticed some strange things, though. The text seemed to follow certain rules of language. There were patterns in how characters combined. Some words appeared frequently, like common words in natural language. The text even seemed to follow Zipf's law, a principle in linguistics that describes how word frequency is distributed in natural languages. Yet, despite all these linguistic features, the text resisted every attempt at decryption. Friedman eventually concluded that the manuscript might be written in a synthetic language, an artificial language created specifically for this book. But if so, what was its grammar? How did it work? And why create such an elaborate language for a single manuscript? Until his death in 1969, Friedman remained fascinated by the Voynich Manuscript. He never solved it, but his careful analysis laid the groundwork for all future research. For decades, many researchers believed the manuscript was written by Roger Bacon. The letter from Marcy had said as much, and Bacon was known for his interest in codes and secret knowledge. But in the 1960s and 70s, scientific analysis began to challenge this attribution. Art historians noted that the illustration style didn't match 13th century artistic conventions. The way the plants were drawn, the artistic techniques used, all suggested a later date. But the real blow came from carbon dating. In 2009, researchers at the University of Arizona performed radiocarbon dating on several pages of the vellum. The results were definitive. The vellum dated to between 1404 and 1438. Roger Bacon died in 1292, over a century before the vellum was even created. This didn't entirely rule out a Bacon connection. Perhaps someone copied his work onto new vellum in the 15th century, but it made it far less likely. Most scholars now place the manuscript's creation in the early to mid-15th century. But if not Bacon, then who and why? The most intuitive theory is that the Voynich manuscript is written in cipher, a code designed to conceal meaningful text. Throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, scholars often used ciphers to protect valuable knowledge. Alchemists encoded their recipes. Magicians concealed their spells. Physicians guarded their remedies. Using a cipher would have been perfectly reasonable for someone with valuable secrets to protect. But if it's a cipher, it's unlike any cipher known from that period. Medieval ciphers were typically simple substitution ciphers, where each letter is replaced by another letter or symbol. These can be broken relatively easily using frequency analysis, looking at which characters appear most often, and comparing them to the most common letters in the suspected underlying language. But the Voynich text doesn't break like a simple substitution cipher. Experts have tried every known cipher technique from the medieval period. None of them work. Could it be a more complex cipher, something beyond the technology of its time? Some researchers have suggested polyalphabetic ciphers or code books, where words are replaced by code words from a key. The problem is that such sophisticated ciphers weren't developed until later. The famous Vigenère cipher, one of the first polyalphabetic ciphers, was published in 1586, more than a century after the Voynich manuscript was created. Could someone have independently invented an advanced cipher system and used it only for this manuscript? It's possible, but it seems unlikely. Why develop such a sophisticated system and never use it elsewhere? Why leave no record of how to decode it? Another theory is that the Voynich manuscript is written in a real but unknown or extinct language, simply using an unfamiliar alphabet. Throughout history, many languages have been lost. We have texts in Linear A from ancient Crete that remain undeciphered. We have mysterious scripts from the Indus Valley Civilization that no one can read. Perhaps the Voynich Manuscript records one of these lost languages. Some researchers have tried to connect the manuscript to specific languages. One theory suggests it might be a Turkish dialect written in an invented script. Another proposes it could be a form of Proto-Romance language, an ancestor of modern Italian, French, and Spanish. In 2014, a linguist named Stephen Bax claimed to have identified some words in the manuscript. He suggested that certain plant names matched Middle Eastern botanical terms. Other scholars, however, found his methodology questionable and his identifications unconvincing. The challenge with the lost language theory is that languages don't exist in isolation. If this was a real language, where are the other texts in this language? Where are the native speakers? Why was this script never used for anything else? Unless, of course, it was a language spoken by a very small community, perhaps even created specifically for that community. This leads us to another intriguing possibility. What if the Voynich manuscript is written in a constructed language, an artificial language created deliberately by one person or a small group? This might sound far-fetched, but the creation of artificial languages has a long history. Medieval scholars created philosophical languages intended to represent concepts logically. In the 13th century, Ramon Lull developed a symbolic system for representing knowledge. In the 17th century, scholars like John Wilkins created elaborate philosophical languages. Could the Voynich manuscript represent an early attempt at such a project? William Friedman, the famous code breaker we mentioned earlier, leaned toward this theory. He believed the manuscript might be written in a synthetic language with its own grammar and vocabulary, created specifically for encoding knowledge in a new form. The advantage of this theory is that it explains why the text has linguistic features, but resists decryption. It's not encrypted in the traditional sense. It's written in a language that simply no longer exists because only a handful of people ever knew it. The disadvantage is that creating a fully functional language is an enormous undertaking. The manuscript contains about 35,000 words. To write that much text in an invented language requires consistent grammar, extensive vocabulary, and remarkable discipline. Could a 15th century scholar have accomplished this? It's possible, but it would have required extraordinary effort for a purpose we still don't understand. Here's a more unusual theory. What if the Voynich manuscript is glossolalia, the phenomenon known as speaking in tongues? Glossolalia is a religious practice where people speak in what sounds like a language, but is actually spontaneous, non-linguistic vocalization. It has been recorded in various religious traditions, including medieval Christian mysticism. Could the Voynich manuscript be a written record of glossolalia? Could someone have believed they were transcribing divine or mystical language, producing text that looks linguistic but has no actual meaning? This theory would explain why the text has some linguistic features but cannot be decoded, because there's nothing to decode. It's language-like but not actually language. The problem with this theory is the consistency of the text. Glossolalia is typically spontaneous and varies greatly. The Voynich text, by contrast, shows remarkable consistency in its use of characters and word structure. It seems too organized to be random, mystical speech. And now we come to perhaps the most controversial theory, that the Voynich Manuscript is an elaborate hoax, a meaningless text created to deceive. This theory has both strong proponents and fierce critics. The argument for a hoax goes something like this. Someone in the early 15th century created the manuscript specifically to sell it to a wealthy collector. They invented an alphabet, created text that looked linguistic but meant nothing, added illustrations to make it seem like a valuable scientific work, and then sold it for a high price. Remember, the letter from Marzi claimed that Emperor Rudolph II paid 600 gold ducats for this manuscript. If that's true, it would have been worth the effort to create an elaborate forgery. The prime suspect, according to hoax theorists, is Edward Kelly, a 16th century English alchemist and medium who worked in Prague and had connections to Rudolph II's court. Kelly was known as a charlatan who fooled many people with his claims of supernatural abilities. Creating a mysterious manuscript would have been right in his wheelhouse. But here's the problem with the hoax theory. The carbon dating places the vellum in the early 15th century, decades before Kelly was born. Could someone have used old vellum to create a forgery later? Yes, but that requires forethought and access to antique materials. Moreover, if it's a hoax, it's remarkably sophisticated. The text shows statistical properties that suggest underlying structure. Creating such text by hand without any linguistic rules would be extremely difficult. In 2013, a linguist named Gordon Rugg claimed he could reproduce Voynich-like text using a simple table and grill system that would have been available in the Renaissance. He demonstrated that meaningful-looking gibberish could be generated relatively easily. However, other researchers pointed out that while Rugg's method could create some Voynich-like text, it didn't fully reproduce all the statistical properties of the actual manuscript. The debate continues. In recent decades, researchers have approached the Voynich manuscript with sophisticated statistical tools unavailable to earlier scholars. One of the most interesting discoveries involves the distribution of word lengths and frequencies. The text follows Zipf's law, a principle that describes how in natural languages a small number of words appear very frequently while most words are rare. In English, for example, words like the, of, and make up a huge proportion of any text. The Voynich text shows a similar pattern, with certain words appearing again and again, while others occur only once or twice. This suggests the text has underlying structure consistent with natural language. But it could also be consistent with a well-designed cipher or constructed language. Another interesting pattern is what researchers call word length distribution. In the Voynich manuscript, words tend to be relatively short, with most being 4 to 6 characters long. This is actually unusual. Most natural languages have a wider distribution of word lengths. Then there's the matter of word repetition. The Voynich text frequently repeats words in close proximity, sometimes twice or even 3 times in a row. While repetition occurs in natural language, the frequency of repetition in the Voynich text is higher than typical. Some researchers interpret these patterns as evidence of meaning. Others see them as signs of artificiality, suggesting either a cipher system or deliberate manufacture of text. Let's return to the illustrations, because they might be our best clue to the manuscript's purpose. The largest section of the manuscript shows plants. If we could identify these plants, we might understand what the text is discussing. Some researchers have claimed to identify certain illustrations. One plant might be a type of sunflower, another could be a lily, a third resembles a type of thistle. But here's where it gets complicated. Many of these identifications are controversial. What one expert sees as a sunflower, another sees as something completely different. And many of the plants don't match any known species at all. One theory is that the illustrator was working from descriptions rather than actual specimens. In the medieval period, herbal manuscripts were often copied and recopied, with artists who had never seen the actual plants trying to reproduce illustrations from earlier texts. Over multiple generations of copying, plants became increasingly stylized and less accurate. Could the Voynich Manuscript be an herbal where the plants have been so corrupted through copying that they no longer resemble real species? Another possibility is that the plants are symbolic or allegorical rather than literal. Medieval and Renaissance texts often used plant imagery to represent concepts or states of being. An alchemical text, for instance, might show imaginary plants to represent stages in a chemical process. This brings us to alchemy, one of the most popular theories about the manuscript's content. Alchemy was a major preoccupation of medieval and Renaissance scholars. It combined practical chemistry with mystical philosophy, seeking to transform base metals into gold and discover the elixir of life. Alchemical texts were often deliberately obscure. Alchemists used elaborate symbolism, coded language, and strange illustrations to conceal their knowledge from the uninitiated. Only those who had been properly taught could understand the true meaning. The Voynich Manuscript certainly fits the profile of an alchemical text. The strange illustrations, the unreadable text, the pharmaceutical section showing jars and containers, all of this is consistent with alchemical manuscripts. The biological section, with its naked women in pools of colored liquid, could represent alchemical processes. In alchemical symbolism, such imagery often represented purification, transformation, or the union of opposite principles. But if it's an alchemical text, why is it so much more obscure than other alchemical manuscripts? Even heavily encoded alchemical texts from this period can eventually be decoded by experts familiar with alchemical symbolism. The Voynich Manuscript has resisted all such attempts. Speaking of the biological section, let's talk about those mysterious women in the pools, because they've generated enormous speculation. The section shows dozens of small female figures, nude, in a complex network of tubes and pools filled with dark green or blue liquid. Some women are entering the pools, others are sitting in them, others appear to be emerging. What does this represent? One theory, as we mentioned, is that it's alchemical symbolism. The pools could represent different stages of chemical transformation, with the women symbolizing the substance being transformed. Another theory is more literal. These might be bathing scenes. Medieval and Renaissance people did use communal baths, and there was a tradition of therapeutic bathing in mineral springs. Perhaps this section describes different types of therapeutic baths and their benefits. A more mystical interpretation suggests these could be spiritual or magical diagrams, representing stages of enlightenment or rituals of some kind. Some researchers have noted that the women all look similar, almost like copies of a single figure. This could suggest symbolic rather than realistic representation. the tubes connecting the pools have also attracted attention. They form a complex network, almost like a circulatory system. Could this be a metaphorical representation of bodily systems, or a cosmological diagram showing the flow of spiritual or mystical forces? We simply don't know. Like everything else in the manuscript, these images are tantalizing but ultimately unclear. With the advent of powerful computers and artificial intelligence, many researchers hoped we were finally on the verge of cracking the Voynich code. Starting in the 1990s, researchers began applying computational linguistic analysis to the manuscript. They could now process the entire text statistically, looking for patterns that would be invisible to the human eye. One of the most sophisticated early efforts was led by researchers at the University of Arizona, who used various statistical methods to analyze word patterns, character frequencies, and structural features. Their conclusion: the text shows features consistent with natural language, but it doesn't match any known language family. Moreover, it shows some statistical anomalies that are difficult to explain. For instance, the text has very low entropy, meaning it's more predictable than most natural languages. If you know the first few characters of a word, you can often predict the remaining characters with higher accuracy than you could in English or other known languages. This could mean several things. It might suggest the text is encoded, with the encoding system reducing entropy. Or it might mean the text is artificial, constructed using rules that make it more regular than natural language. In recent years, machine learning and neural networks have been applied to the manuscript with mixed results. In 2018, researchers at the University of Alberta trained a neural network on hundreds of languages, then had it analyze the Voynich text. The AI suggested the text might be encoded Hebrew, with letters rearranged using a system called alphagramming. The researchers attempted to decode the text using this hypothesis. They claimed to have identified some recognizable Hebrew words in the result. However, Hebrew scholars quickly pointed out that the decoded text was mostly gibberish that didn't form coherent Hebrew sentences. While a few words might look vaguely Hebrew-like, the overall result made no sense. This illustrates a fundamental challenge. Even with AI, we're still making assumptions about what the underlying language or encoding system might be. If our assumptions are wrong, the AI will produce nonsense. Other machine learning approaches have tried to identify the language family or detect patterns that might reveal the encoding method. So far, none have produced convincing results that the scholarly community accepts. The application of AI to the Voynich manuscript has sparked an interesting debate about the limits of computational approaches to historical mysteries. AI is very good at finding patterns in data, but the Voynich manuscript might be a case where pattern recognition isn't enough. If the text is written in an entirely unique system, whether an unknown language, a personal code, or an elaborate forgery, no amount of pattern analysis will decode it without knowing the key. It's like trying to decode a message written in a language you've never encountered, using an alphabet you've never seen, following grammatical rules you don't know, possibly about subjects you're unfamiliar with. AI can tell you that patterns exist, but it can't tell you what those patterns mean. Some researchers argue that we need to combine AI analysis with traditional historical scholarship. Perhaps understanding who created the manuscript and why is more important than analyzing the text itself. Others maintain that a sufficiently advanced AI, with access to vast linguistic databases and sophisticated analysis tools, will eventually crack the code. As of 2025, the debate continues, and the manuscript remains unread. Let's look at some of the most interesting recent theories about the manuscript's language and content. In 2018, a researcher named Ahmet Ardig claimed the manuscript was written in Turkish using an invented alphabet. He provided translations of several pages, claiming they contained advice about health and astrology. However, Turkish linguists examined his translations and found them unconvincing. The translated text seemed to be modern Turkish rather than the 15th century form of the language that would have been contemporary with the manuscript. Moreover, Ardig's translation method appeared arbitrary, with no clear rules for how characters corresponded to sounds. The Hebrew theory, mentioned earlier, continues to have proponents. Some researchers note that the word patterns in Voynich text are similar to Semitic languages, like Hebrew and Arabic, which have distinctive root structures. But attempts to decode the text as Hebrew have consistently failed to produce readable results. Another intriguing theory suggests the manuscript might be related to Catalan, or another Romance language from the Western Mediterranean. This is based on analysis of word structure and some possible identifications of plant names. Each new theory generates excitement, but so far none has withstood rigorous scrutiny. One challenge that's often overlooked is that even if we could match the Voynich characters to sounds, we don't know how those sounds combine to form meaningful words in whatever language is being used. Imagine trying to read English if you'd never heard it spoken. You might guess that GH makes a G sound, but in tough, through, and ghost, it makes 3 different sounds. Without knowing the pronunciation rules, you can't correctly sound out the words. And without sounding them out, you might not recognize them, even if you knew the spoken language. The Voynich manuscript might have this problem in extreme form. Even if we correctly identified what sounds the characters represent, we might not know how they combine. Without knowing, we can't even attempt to match written words to spoken words we might recognize. Let's step back from the text and focus on what we can actually see and analyze: the illustrations. Art historians have spent considerable effort trying to date and contextualize the manuscript's artistic style. The illustrations show characteristics of early 15th century Northern Italian or possibly Central European art. The way the human figures are drawn, the use of color, the artistic conventions, all of these point to this time period and region. This is consistent with the carbon dating of the vellum, which placed it between 1404 and 1438. The artist appears to have been reasonably skilled, but not a master. The drawings are competent, but somewhat crude. The proportions of human figures are sometimes off. The plants, while detailed, lack the precision of the best medieval herbals. This could mean the manuscript was created by a scholar who was an adequate artist, but not a professional illuminator. Or it could mean it was created quickly, without the care typically lavished on important manuscripts. Interestingly, the paint pigments used have been analyzed. They're consistent with paints available in 15th century Europe, with no signs of modern materials. This rules out the possibility that it's a recent forgery created in the 19th or 20th century. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams that resemble zodiac wheels. These diagrams show naked female figures arranged around a central sun or star, with text labels that presumably describe the astrological significance. Some of these labels have been tentatively identified. Researchers believe they can recognize versions of zodiac sign names, Pisces for Pisces, Sagitta for Sagittarius, and so on. If these identifications are correct, it suggests the text might be a European language written in a cipher or invented alphabet. The zodiac names would have been common knowledge and might have been written in recognizable form, even if the rest of the text was encoded. However, other researchers dispute these identifications, arguing that the similarity to zodiac names might be coincidental or might reflect researchers seeing what they expect to see. The presence of zodiac imagery does tell us something about the manuscript's cultural context. Astrology was a respected science in the 15th century, practiced by physicians, scholars, and courtiers. A manuscript dealing with astrology would have been valuable and taken seriously. The cosmological section contains some of the manuscript's most elaborate illustrations. One diagram shows a series of concentric circles with text and small illustrations of castles or buildings. Some researchers have interpreted this as a map, perhaps showing a city or region with important locations marked. Others see it as a cosmological or philosophical diagram, representing levels of existence or stages of spiritual development. Another fold-out page shows an even more complex diagram with multiple circular elements connected by lines and filled with text and small symbols. What's particularly interesting about these diagrams is that they suggest knowledge and sophistication. Creating such elaborate diagrammatic representations requires abstract thinking and the ability to organize complex information visually. This argues against the manuscript being mere gibberish or a crude forgery. Someone put considerable thought into these diagrams, whether they represent real knowledge or an elaborate fiction. Near the end of the manuscript is a section showing what appear to be vessels, jars, and containers of various types. Each illustration shows a different type of container, often with plant parts emerging from or placed next to it. Each is labeled with text. This section looks very much like pharmaceutical manuscripts from the medieval period, which would list remedies along with instructions for their preparation. If we could identify the plants associated with each container, we might be able to guess what ailments or conditions are being treated. And if we could read the text, we might have recipes for medieval medicines. But once again, the plant illustrations are ambiguous. Some might be recognizable species, but many are unclear or possibly imaginary. One interesting detail: some of the containers are shown with what appear to be astrological symbols. This is consistent with medieval pharmaceutical practice, which often linked remedies to astrological timing. Certain medicines were believed to be most effective when prepared or administered under specific planetary influences. And so, the Voynich Manuscript remains one of history's most captivating mysteries. Perhaps it will be solved tomorrow. Perhaps it will remain a mystery for another 600 years. Or perhaps the mystery itself is the answer. Thank you for spending these 2 hours with Tales of History. Whether you're still awake or already drifting into dreams, I hope this journey through time has brought you peace. If you enjoyed this story, Consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries and forgotten tales. There's always another story waiting to be told. Until next time, sleep well. Dream of ancient mysteries, and remember that some of history's most beautiful questions are the ones we can't answer. Good night.